Okay, so what we're looking at right now, guys, to start this video is a broken HDMI port, and I'm trying to show you it under the microscope. You can see there's one pin there. Sorry for the bad angle, but there's one pin there that's not touching, and so it doesn't look like much, but the damage is actually behind the HDMI port on the motherboard. But yeah, either way, it's not going to work. So let's get into the video, and I guarantee you guys, if you follow these steps, your success rate for these repairs are going to be so much higher. Okay, what's going on, guys? Welcome to Tech Pros in Scranton, Pennsylvania. As you can see here, what I'm doing is disassembling Ps4. We're not going to go into too much information on how to take this apart. There's a million other videos out there explaining how to disassemble a Ps4 on YouTube. So you guys are welcome to just research that, and it's actually pretty straightforward. First thing I'm doing is cleaning the motherboard and make sure that it's nice and free of debris, dirt, anything that can get in the way of me soldering or desoldering that whole thing. Okay, I'm removing all the thermal paste right here, trying to get rid of the old stuff because that's really sticky and it can kind of get all over you on your fingers. And once you have that on your fingers, then it'll transfer to your clothes. It'll get on other parts of the electronics, and it's just a mess. So it's better to remove that stuff, and we use acetone, or you can use alcohol or acetone to get rid of it, rather than actually spending a lot of money on expensive solvents and kits to dissolve thermal paste. Okay, so now we're drying the system, we're drying the motherboard, and we're going to move on pretty soon here. Let's fast forward. All right, so this is a really important step right here. This is actually everything we do in this video is essential to making sure that this repair is a success. Okay, so this is actually heat-resistant tape specifically for electronics, and they use this for different reasons. Like, basically, after making a machine, they'll put it in certain areas just to prevent heat from damaging the board over time. In our case, in this scenario, what we're going to use it for is to protect the components behind the HDMI port. We want to cover those up and make sure they're completely 100% safe. Okay, so on the back side, we flip the board over. You see there's a silver plate there. That silver plate is actually there for a reason, and it's basically protecting other components. So what we want to do is cover any holes, make sure none of our paste or any of our heat gets inside or underneath that metal plate. All right, so as you can see, what we're doing at this point is we're applying the lead solder. There's a couple different types of solder that you can get. In this case, we're using like a 30 to 70% mixture, something like that. And there's like some kind of, there's like 15 or 30% lead in the solder. So you have to be very careful. You definitely want ventilation and, adequate ventilation for, for health reasons. You don't want to inhale any of this. This is very dangerous stuff to work with. So if you're doing these types of repairs on a regular basis, make sure you do get some kind of vacuum system or ventilation system. Get that smoke away from your face. Make sure that you're safe at all times. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm adding that to, these are the 4 pins I was talking about earlier, and this is the hard part. Removing this from the motherboard is the hardest part of this job because the board is so thick. So the only real way to do that is to actually heat the board itself, the motherboard, not just the soldering pins or the points where you're soldering, but the actual board itself. All right, so using clamps is really something that you have to do here in order to prevent the board from moving and in keeping the motherboard sturdy and safe. Okay, so we're going to preheat. We're going to start adding the heat to the board and slowly work from the top down. Just try to spread the heat out as much as possible, and we're ready to go. So everything's in place. Now we are going up to about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and if you can think of the stove in your home, that is enough to get a 3rd degree burn if you accidentally touch the something in the stove after it's been preheated. So once we get the motherboard preheated, we're going to slowly control that heat and work it down towards the HDMI port, and then you'll start to see that the flux will start to melt. It'll liquefy, and will start to react with the metal. Shortly after that, once the metal actually liquefies, you're going to notice there'll be a flashing point where you'll see it turn from a solid to a liquid, and then you can actually tap on the HDMI port and it'll drop right out. The last thing you want to do is pull on that port or cause any kind of stress to, since there's so much heat. At that point you can damage the other metal components that are inside the motherboard. So you don't want that to lift off the board where you're going to have to retrace or do any kind of extra work. So make sure that you don't pull the HDMI port off the board, and you should be in good shape at that point. Okay, moving on. At this point, I can't stress how important it is to keep that board nice and warm, because the very next step is to remove the solder with your solder sucker. So as long as the HDMI port is out of the way, you can pull that solder right out of the board, open those little holes up, and then get ready for the new HDMI port to be installed. We're back to the microscope. We can see that we have there's some solder that we have to clean up. We basically need to prep these little pins for new solder, for some fresh new solder. So the way to do that is you're going to use a desoldering wick, and the board right now might look dirty, but it's actually in great shape. There's no damage. We're fortunate. You see how small all the components behind the HDMI port are, and so by adding all that heat, that 340 to 380 degrees Celsius, one of those little diodes could burn up very quickly. So that's why the tape is so essential to this repair. All right, so now, so we're using the desoldering wick and a little bit of flux to clean up all the metal on the board. Now we're going to take some acetone and alcohol. Actually, acetone. I don't use alcohol anymore, but the acetone is going to just remove any flux, and you can see how clean the board is now after we just remove all that. Okay, so now that that's clean, now we're going to add our solder, which once again does have lead in it. So keep your ventilation system on, and make sure that none of this stuff goes in your nose or mouth, and don't breathe it. It's simple as that. Okay, so now what we want to do, this is really important, because this is called tinning. We're going to tin the motherboard with some fresh solder, and so we're also going to, in the next clip, we're going to tin the HDMI port, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, tinning the board, you want to use the flux. That's key. The flux itself is going to give you some nice round balls of solder, and you know sometimes they're a little too big, so you just want to remove any excess and just try to get those balls of solder as even as possible. I made a mistake right there. That's something that you definitely don't want to do. You don't want to put any solder in any of those holes, those 4 holes, because if they're closed, you can't get that HDMI port on. And now that we don't have our heat tape on here, this repair just got a little bit more difficult for me. So now what I have to do, we're going to tin the HDMI port next, but in order to fix the problem with that hole now, I'm going to have to use this. You see at the top there's a heat gun. It's a really small tip, and so I'm going to have to really focus that heat in that corner. Now there's more inherent risk now that I did that to damaging a small component, and I like to try to avoid that as much as possible when I'm doing these types of repairs. But we are tinning the HDMI port right now to make sure that there is fresh solder on those 4 pins, and all the other little pins, and you have to be very careful with this. You don't want to put too much heat on that HDMI port, so take your time with it. And once again, flux is your best friend. So now I have to figure out how I'm going to get that that ball of solder out of the holes. Now here's an isolated tip on a hot air reflow station, and you can see how that tip is much smaller than the hot air gun that we use to remove the HDMI port to begin with. So I'm holding it at an angle facing towards me in order to not have any hot air going towards any components on the motherboard, which is the opposite direction. And you have to keep a steady hand when you're doing this, or else you can really damage those pieces that are underneath that aluminum tip. And I'm struggling with this. This is not easy. So I'm trying to heat that up to where it's going to melt, and once again, it requires a lot of heat. So now we're going to heat that up, and we're going to try to suck that out without damaging anything with the solder sucker. I'll get it, because this repair was a success. But if you don't have that tool to do this, then you need that hot air reflow station to do this repair correctly for two reasons. One, for this reason, and the second one is actually to add the solder in the hole when the HDMI port is actually in place, which we're going to get to right now. So now we have the HDMI port actually placed. We did remove that stubborn ball of solder safely without damaging anything. It just took a lot more time than I was hoping for, but we got it off. And so now what we're doing is we're lining up those small little pins that are behind the HDMI port with the actual pins on the motherboard to make sure everything is in sync. And then we're going to put a bead of solder on one of the bigger pins to hold that HDMI port in place, make sure it doesn't shift left or right and come out of line with the motherboard. Now that's what I do before I start actually attaching it. Then I'll flip over the board and then start adding more solder. And you actually do need that hot air reflow station at this point again to allow the solder to melt into the wafer and fill the hole to where the actual HDMI port is not going to come off again, and it's not going to break free. If you don't do this, then when somebody goes to plug that HDMI port in, the back of the system, it's just going to disconnect. It's just going to come off the board. So the solder has to actually get in from the top side of the board to the bottom side all the way and hold that in place. Okay, so the soldering gun itself is not strong enough to melt it that much, so you actually have to heat the wafer and use the soldering gun at the same time for the solder to melt throughout. Okay, so you're not going to use the hot air gun for the pins behind the HDMI port, just for the 4 pins that actually attach the port to the motherboard. Alright, so now that we have our HDMI port placed back on the board, our new port is installed, it's time to test it out. And what I want to do is I want to replace all the thermal pads that cool the board. I want to replace all of them because the ones that were on there are just old and used. So we put here, at this business anyway, we put brand new thermal pads on each PS4 just to make sure that it's not going to come back to us with some kind of overheating issue once we have taken it apart and all that stuff. We don't really want to have to open this system again for at least another couple of years. That would be fantastic if this machine lasts 5 or 10 more years because of what we've actually done here today. So we're going to put on some new thermal pads on both sides. This is the bottom side of the motherboard right here, where the processor is actually touching. That's the heat sink that you can see there. And then this is the other side of the motherboard, where it's the top side, basically the processor's underneath this portion. So we're replacing those as well. We're going to do all what's there, 2, 4, 6, 8, all 8, and those are little memory chips. That's your processor's memory right there for your PS4 that you see. So they get pretty hot because games are really intense on memory. They consume a lot of memory. So we got some new thermal pads going on both sides of the board. Let's fast forward to the next portion. We're almost done, guys. I know this is a long video, but I guarantee you, if you actually watch this video and jot down these steps, then you could be making money repairing PS4s, because they all break. We do several of these every single week, and so now it's time to just put that heat sink back on. These 2 screws are all I put on to test it out, just in case there's any issues. I don't want to have to remove everything all over again, so we're just going to tighten these 2 guys up and then plug it in, turn it on, and if we have video, it's a success, and we move on. Then we'll seal the unit up. So we're turning it on now. We just put on some power to the system, and we're just going to wait a few seconds here and just give it a few moments. There you go. There we have some. We have a video feed coming from the system, which is fantastic. If you don't have anything, then you have a serious problem, and you made a mistake. There's something that you didn't do correctly throughout this process, and I do promise you that this is effective. So what you just got done watching is roughly anywhere between 2 to 4 hours of time that was spent repairing this PS4. It's a huge process. It takes about half a day or something like that. If you rush it, then there's a good chance that you're going to make a mistake. For all you guys out there that have made it this far, we're at 16.5 minutes into the video. It's pretty long video. I want to extend an offer. If you are struggling with something with your computer or game console, I'll throw you 25% off for watching this video if you're listening at this very moment. Just mention the video with whatever issue you have, and we'll knock off 25% off of your service and save you some money, which could be a lot of money in some cases. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Any questions, feel free to give the shop a call, and we'll see you in the next video.